Prepare yourself to leave the safety of the modern world behind and step into the damp, terrifying darkness of a medieval dungeon. We often think of the Middle Ages as a time of chivalry and romance, but the legal reality was a nightmare of flesh and bone. Today, we are not just looking at tools, we are going to walk through the exact physical and psychological experience of the 5 most horrific torture methods ever devised by humanity. You have to understand that in the medieval legal system, circumstantial evidence was often not enough to secure a conviction for a major crime. They needed a confession, a spoken admission of guilt, to make the judgment valid in the eyes of God and the king. This legal requirement turned torture into a formalized bureaucratic procedure known simply as the question. The executioner was not just a sadist. He was a paid professional, a craftsman of pain who knew exactly how far to push the human body without extinguishing the spark of life. Imagine yourself stripped of your clothes, shivering in the cold air, surrounded by the smell of old blood and fear. You look into the eyes of a man who has no hatred for you, but who has a job to do that involves dismantling your sanity piece by piece. Let us begin with the first and perhaps most infamous method, a device that became the very symbol of the Inquisition throughout Europe. It was known as the rack, or in England, by the terrifying nickname, the Duke of Exeter's daughter. The concept was deceptively simple. It was a wooden frame raised off the ground, with a roller at both the top and the bottom. You would be laid on your back upon the wooden planks, your wrists tied securely to the top roller, and your ankles bound with thick hemp ropes to the bottom. At first, it might just feel uncomfortable, the rough wood digging into your spine and the cold shackles chafing your skin. But then the torturer begins to turn the handle, the ratchets clicking loudly in the silence of the room, like a clock counting down your doom. As the ropes tighten, your arms are pulled up and your legs are pulled down, stretching your body beyond its natural limits. The first sensation is a burning pain in your muscles as they are pulled taut like the strings of a lyre. But the questioning continues, and if you do not confess, the handle turns again. Now comes the sound that haunts the nightmares of anyone who has ever witnessed it. The sickening pop of cartilage and bone giving way. Your shoulders are slowly pulled out of their sockets, followed by your hips and knees, leaving you in a state of agonizing dislocation. The pain is absolute and blinding, firing through every nerve ending in your body. Yet the position keeps your lungs open so you can scream. Survivors of the rack were often left permanently disabled, unable to lift their arms or walk without crutches for the rest of their shattered lives. It was a method designed to make you feel that your own body was betraying you, stretching you into a shape that nature never intended. But while the rack was a torture of mechanics, our second method weaponized the primal fear of the animal kingdom. Imagine being restrained on a table, unable to move a single inch, your hands and feet locked in iron shackles. The executioner approaches you not with a blade, but with a metal cage containing a large, starving rat. This is the rat torture, a method that relies on pure psychological terror and the survival instinct of a desperate beast. They place the cage upside down on your bare abdomen, trapping the rat between the metal bars and your soft flesh. At first, the rat is just confused, sniffing at your skin and scurrying around the small space. Then, the torture truly begins as they place hot coals or a burning torch on top of the metal cage. As the metal heats up, the air inside the cage becomes scorching hot, and the rat begins to panic in the sweltering temperature. The animal knows it must escape the heat, or die, but the metal bars are too strong to bite through. It realizes that the only soft surface, the only possible escape route, is the floor of the cage, which happens to be your stomach. Driven by a frenzy of survival, the rat begins to claw and bite its way into your body. You would feel the sharp teeth tearing through your skin, and the frantic scratching of claws as it burrows deeper and deeper. The rat literally eats its way into your intestines, seeking refuge from the fire in the gory warmth of your internal organs. The psychological horror of having a living creature inside you is something that breaks the mind long before the physical damage kills the body. This method was allegedly used during the Dutch Revolt, a terrifying reminder that human creativity knows no bounds when it comes to inflicting pain. Now, let us move to a method that turned the laws of gravity against the victim in the most grotesque way possible. The saw sounds like a tool for a carpenter, but in the Middle Ages, it was an instrument of purification and death. This punishment was often reserved for those accused of acts deemed unnatural, such as witchcraft or heresy. You would be taken to a public square, stripped naked, and hung upside down by your ankles from a large wooden frame. This inverted position was not a random choice. It was a calculated medical decision designed to prolong your suffering. When you are upside down, the blood rushes to your head, keeping your brain oxygenated and preventing you from passing out due to shock or blood loss. Two executioners would then take a long two-man lumber saw and position it right between your legs. They would begin to saw through your body, working rhythmically and slowly, slicing through the pelvic bone and into the abdomen. Because of the blood flow to your brain, you would remain fully conscious and screaming as they cut through your intestines and organs. You would literally watch and feel yourself being divided in half, a living anatomy lesson for the horrified crowd. Historical accounts suggest that some victims remained alive and conscious until the saw reached the navel or even the chest diaphragm. It was a spectacle of absolute brutality, intended to show the crowd that the state had the power to unmake a human being completely. If the saw was too loud and messy, our fourth method was a silent, slow descent into madness, known as the Judas cradle. This device looked almost artistic in its simplicity, a pyramid-shaped wooden seat with a sharp, pointed top. You would be hoisted into the air by ropes and pulleys, suspended above this terrible point. Then, the executioner would slowly lower you down so that the tip of the pyramid entered your body through your most sensitive orifice. Like the other methods, the Judas cradle did not rely on tearing or cutting, but on the relentless force of gravity and muscle exhaustion. You would be lowered just enough so that your entire body weight was resting on that single sharp point. If you tried to use your muscles to hold yourself up and relieve the pressure, you would eventually become exhausted and collapse back down. The pain was a constant, dull, tearing agony that stretched the internal tissues and could last for hours or even days. To add to the horror, the device was rarely washed between victims, meaning it was covered in the blood and filth of previous prisoners. If the physical trauma did not kill you, the inevitable bacterial infection would finish the job days later in a feverish delirium. This method was particularly feared because it did not leave broken bones or flayed skin, making it a favorite for extractors of confessions who wanted to leave fewer external marks. It was a torture of time, forcing the victim to participate in their own suffering by trying to stay awake and hold themselves up. Finally, we arrive at the absolute pinnacle of medieval public execution, a method so complex and brutal it required a master craftsman to perform. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was reserved for the most heinous criminals like murderers and bandits. You would be taken to a scaffold where a large wooden wagon wheel was lying on the ground or propped up on blocks. You would be tied to the wheel, your limbs spread-eagled across the heavy wooden spokes. The executioner would then take a heavy iron bar or a hammer, specifically designed for this gruesome task. His goal was not to kill you, but to methodically shatter every major long bone in your body while keeping you alive. He would start with the shins, then the thighs, then the forearms and the upper arms, delivering precise, crushing blows. The sound of the heavy iron smashing through bone would echo across the silent square, a sound that the crowd would never forget. Once your limbs were broken in multiple places, they became flexible, like wet rope. The executioner would then take your shattered limbs and weave them through the spokes of the wheel, twisting your body into a grotesque, impossible shape. At this point, you are a living pretzel of pain, every movement sending shockwaves through your nervous system. The wheel would then be hoisted onto a tall pole and planted in the ground, leaving you suspended in the air against the sky. You would be left there to die of shock, dehydration, or exposure to the elements, sometimes lingering for 2 or 3 days. Birds of prey, seeing a helpless meal, would often descend to peck at the eyes and living flesh of the victim while they were still breathing. Sometimes, if the judges were feeling merciful, they would order a coup de grace, a blow to the chest or neck to end the suffering instantly. But this mercy often had to be bought by the victim's family, who would bribe the executioner to aim for the heart early. These 5 methods are not just stories from a horror movie. They are the documented reality of how our ancestors maintained order. They reveal a dark truth about human nature, that we are capable of engineering the most efficient systems of suffering when we believe it serves a higher purpose. The torture chamber was a place where the human body was treated as a puzzle to be solved with iron and fire. It forces us to ask ourselves, how thin is the veneer of civilization that separates us from the executioner in the dungeon? Today, we look back at the rack, the rat, the saw, the cradle, and the wheel with disbelief and horror. But for centuries, these were the tools of justice, accepted and watched by thousands of cheering spectators. So the next time you complain about a parking ticket or a long line at the courthouse, remember the poor souls who faced the question. Remember the sound of the ratchet turning and the shadow of the breaking wheel against the sun. Be grateful that you live in an age where the truth is sought with evidence and not extracted with the crushing weight of iron. The screams of the past may have faded into history, but the instruments remain in museums to remind us of what we are capable of. Let this be a chilling reminder that the history of law is written in blood, and the road to modern justice was paved with the suffering of the damned.